you be able to speak a bit about what emergentism is and what panpsychism is?
Yeah, okay. Well, first thing I'll say, there was a study by Chris Timmerman and others at Imperial College 2 years ago or so on how psychedelics seem to shift people's metaphysical views. It's a general shift from physicalism to panpsychism. Panpsychism, for those who don't know, means that, minds are ubiquitous throughout nature. So in man, mouse, molecule, and beyond, plants, fungi, basic, like basic forms, not in jackets, for example, though, because they are aggregates, so not in rocks and tables and stuff like that. So, nuanced forms of it. Different varieties of panpsychism as well. But anyway, yeah, so psychedelics seem to shift people towards that kind of more mind-based. I'll say this, I don't think the definition of panpsychism in these papers are particularly robust. So they kind of push, and Jussi Julka's done a really great study, it seems, on this as well, which seems to indicate that people, he calls it idealism, but I think generally speaking, one can say that they seem to push people into a view where mind is more important than it generally is taken to be in early 21st century Western thought. So maybe that's idealism, the view that we project, the mind projects reality, or maybe it's panpsychism, that minds exist throughout nature, or maybe even forms of dualism, mind and matter are separate. Yeah, so that's the sort of empirical findings. But you have to be a bit skeptical about that, because I think empirical findings can be based on like trends in society. If people expect this kind of thing, then they're maybe more likely to interpret it like that. There's also kind of the demographic was very Western, so when you look at the Americas, you get different kind of views. The question is whether they are fundamentally, can be the same. This is an interesting project, an old debate. Perennialism as against contextualism. Why? Well, and why the interest in panpsychism? So what the interesting thing, first of all, is that if people's views do change to something which is categorized as panpsychism, I suppose there's two questions here. Like, number one, why does that happen? Number two, what is panpsychism, and has it got anything going for it? Because again, it seems like a lot of psychedelic experiences, it seems like crazy thing to believe in a particular Western culture at the moment. It wasn't in the past, of course. In ancient Greece, that Plato and Aristotle, they thought plants had basic forms of desire and so on. It seems that we changed with the 17th century and scientific revolution, where with Descartes especially, where matter became completely soulless. So only humans had souls, and the rest of nature was extension, mathematical, geometric space. So you can trace the reasons why people think panpsychism must be wrong if you look at that kind of metaphysical viewpoint, which was kind of a change from the Aristotelianism, which was very common in the West and scholastics until that point. So at that point, then we got rid of, the scientific conception got rid of the teleological view of the world, that there were purposes in nature, aims in nature, and it got rid of the view of nature as ensouled in any way, or alive, or has any intrinsic value. So this is all negative. This is just kind of preamble to saying this is why people think partly panpsychism's nuts. But I think, it's not nuts. Essentially, it's a parsimonious view, I think, that mind is matter. It brings it all together. And, in this monistic strand of panpsychism that I put forward, which is related to Spinoza's view, for example. And if mind is matter, that means that, the more complex the matter, the more complex the mind. So humans have a very complex form of mind, or some people do, correlated to the complex brain, the complex nervous system, body, and so on. And like a cell has, relatively simple, it's still complex, but a relatively simple body, and thus a relatively simple mind, maybe just basic desire or fear or happy, joy or so on. Why would you not believe this? Well, partly because of the historical reasons I said, but also another reason is the kind of neuroessentialism, which is a kind of, again, another axiom which is never really, it is questioned, but it's not generally questioned amongst us, which is the view that the brain is a necessary and sufficient condition for consciousness. Now, this proposition is not verifiable, and it's not falsifiable. It's not really a scientific proposition, in other words. It's a metaphysical assumption. because of the problem of other minds, the fact that the mind, one aspect of the mind is debatable, of course, is that it's private. I have access to my memories from yesterday, you have access to yours, but not vice versa. I can maybe infer them from your behavior, what you say, and if brain imaging perhaps, but there's never a direct access to it in the same way, which means that mind is fundamentally non-empirical. That's what privacy means. And some people argue privacy is the core mark of the mental, beyond intentionality, beyond aspatiality, and so on. So we cannot empirically know whether, for example, plants have any form of intrinsic value. So there's always an assumption that they haven't. It's also an assumption that the brain is necessary. And this leads to all kinds of problems. So let's not assume that. Let's assume that matter is an abstraction. In other words, our understanding of matter is only part of what matter really is. And that if we were to know it concretely, this is one of the arguments, we would realize that it has an element of mind to it. Bertrand Russell put forward this view, for example, Whitehead, Spinoza, Leibniz. A lot of great thinkers believed this, but it never really made it to mainstream. I think we've been hijacked by a certain kind of quite dogmatic metaphysic, which even changes our experiments, scientific experiments. We do experiments to find the neural correlates of consciousness. Why not look at the whole body, for example? Perhaps we'll find other correlates. And why stop at the body even? Then you get into the extended mind theories. So so that's kind of a negative argument for panpsychism. In other words, the opposite of it doesn't work, right? Well, yeah, or at least it's not definite. There's based on assumptions. So that's the start.
Well, just to comment on that, it's fascinating because I suppose before coming across your work, also people like Bernardo Kastrup, I kind of thought that any view other than sort of materialism or emergentism kind of just was kind of wacky, as you kind of say. Then it's fascinating to hear that that's actually in a way a more recent invention, because people like Plato and philosophers in the past actually thought this is pretty plausible, and maybe they would even look at us and how we sort of develop philosophy and go, wait, why all the assumptions, and then
we're in a fashion, like philosophy's going in fashion, and we're in a sort of a few centuries long fashion now of thinking about the mind in a certain way, which might change, But sorry, I cut into.
No, and I guess, and even as you say there, like, it's not that. I mean, maybe we'll find out that maybe there's some way to say that emergentism could be right. It's not like completely off the table, but there's also, as you say, and as you write in your book, there's actually it's just to say that the brain causes consciousness is just, it might, but it's just an assumption.
And where do you draw the line? I mean, do you include what kind of brains? Even like, so do you include an octopus brain, very different from ours, the brain of a bat, a bee, an ant? They've done experiments with jellyfish recently showing that they can learn without brains. Starfish seem to adapt to the environment without brains, and so on. Plants, likewise. You can see. Gustav Fechner, who sort of founded psychophysics, he was a panpsychist, and he argued that just because we correlate our nerves to mental states in humans doesn't mean that these are necessary conditions. So, like the analogy he makes with musical instruments, he says, every time, let's say someone's only heard music through stringed instruments, guitars, lutes, so on harpsichords, and then one day they think, therefore, stringed instruments are the necessary conditions for music, and then one day they hear a flute, and they're like, okay, actually there are other conditions. We don't know it's a necessary condition. We just don't know that. And of course that also relates to modern ideas about AI, or artificial sentience rather, whether machines can be conscious, So if they could, it would mean they wouldn't have brains, obviously. They might have something based on brains, but not necessarily, right? And if you accept that, then why not accept it in plants as well? When you realize that they can see through their eyes, simply they can't focus, but they can sense different forms of light. Latest experiments have shown they can hear water, some of them can, so on and so forth. They adapt to their environment. They have preferences. They seek out certain prey rather than others. And why not see the whole plant as a kind of moving brain?
And when you say that there, like about AI, it makes me think that maybe it's a bit, even dangerous to just assume what and what does not have consciousness, because we need to actually carefully think about, you create things that have these kinds of intelligence and competencies, and it's not immediately obvious, what and if they have internal states. I mean, one thing that I've talked to a lot of biologists in someone called Michael Levin's lab, and they do like loads of cool things with like single-celled organisms and showing like that they can move, they can learn things, and it's like it just gets weird because you're like, jellyfish. I mean, go to single-celled organisms, they can do things, and you're like, they obviously don't have brains. They don't even have a nerve cell. They are a cell, single cell, and they're so it's just the sort of range.
Of that we've assumed too much, I think. With like brains, essentially. Also, the brain, the concept brain is an abstraction. The brain literally, concretely, is linked to the whole nervous system going through the body, and that in turn is linked to the other organs and tissues of the body and so on, and that in turn is linked to the external environment. So why cut it off immediately? I was listening to part of your interview with Carl Friston, and he said the brain is completely closed off to the external environment. All it gets is senses, like impulses from the eyes and whatever, but actually those impulses come from the outside world. They come from like light comes from the outside world, hits the eye, goes to the visual cortex and so on. That's one long process. There's no like artificial cutoff point where suddenly it starts from the eye inwards. It's one process, and this is part of process philosophy, and it relates to extended mind. And so when you cut it off like that, you're kind of making artificial cuts in reality. Same with the brain. You cut it off at at the neck, as it were. You're making an artificial cut. In reality, this is one whole interactive system between brain, body, and external world. There's no artificial cut, really.